Margaret Sullivan's coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the cabin's wooden floor as she watched the massive grizzly bear drag something heavy across her Virginia property. The enormous female moved with deliberate purpose, gripping a torn canvas bag between her powerful jaws, a bag that should never exist in these Blue Ridge Mountains where grizzlies hadn't roamed for over a century. The bag wasn't dead weight. Something inside was moving. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson's scream pierced the morning air from the adjacent property, binoculars clattering to her porch as she stumbled backward. The sound echoed through the valley like a death knell, sending every bird within a mile into panicked flight. Margaret's arthritic hands pressed against the window glass, her wedding ring clicking against the pane as childhood memories of her late husband Bernard flooded back, his gentle voice saying, "Maggie, some things find us when we need them most." "Call 911, she whispered to herself, yet her feet remained frozen. What was a grizzly doing in Virginia? And why did that weathered canvas bag look exactly like the one Bernard used for his wildlife research? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie Sullivan had been preparing for death long before the grizzly bear appeared at her door. At 67, she'd already outlived her purpose, or so she told herself each morning while counting out pills she could barely afford. The modest cabin in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains had become both sanctuary and prison since Bernard's sudden heart attack 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but his wildlife photographs and a property tax bill that climbed 40% higher each year. "I'm not getting any younger," she whispered to Bernard's framed photograph on the kitchen table, the same conversation she'd held every morning since the funeral. The Medicare gaps were bleeding her dry. $340 monthly for heart medication alone, while her nurse's pension barely covered groceries. The realtor's card sat propped against the sugar bowl like a white flag of surrender. Sunrise Manor Assisted Living, $8,000 monthly, but peace of mind is priceless. The 40-acre property had been Bernard's dream, not hers. For 30 years, he'd transformed their inherited land into an unofficial wildlife sanctuary, installing motion cameras and feeding stations throughout the dense woodland. Neighbors called him the Bear Whisperer, with a mixture of affection and exasperation, especially after his heated confrontations with Sheriff Tom Bradford over aggressive wildlife management policies at town meetings. What Maggie hadn't told anyone, not even Tori, her estranged daughter living 2 hours away in Richmond, was how desperately she missed being needed. 42 years as an ICU nurse, then another 20 caring for Bernard through diabetes and heart disease, had defined her entire identity. Now the silence in the cabin felt suffocating, broken only by the tick of Bernard's old grandfather clock and her own labored breathing after climbing the porch steps. Tori Sullivan Hayes hadn't spoken to her mother since Bernard's funeral, their relationship severed 15 years earlier over bitter words about Maggie's interference in her marriage. The divorce had been ugly, and Maggie's attempts to help had only driven her daughter further away. Now, at 42 and unemployed since COVID layoffs, Tori struggled with her own financial demons while raising 2 children Maggie had never been allowed to meet. The cabin's isolation had once felt romantic when Bernard was alive, but now it amplified every creak, every settling sound, every reminder that she was utterly alone. Mrs. Patterson, her 82-year-old neighbor, was her only regular human contact, and even that consisted mainly of worried glances across the property line and occasional offerings of casseroles that Maggie pretended to enjoy. Bernard's wildlife cameras still blinked red in the darkness, faithfully recording the deer, raccoons, and occasional black bears that wandered through their woodland paradise. He'd spent countless hours reviewing footage, documenting animal behavior patterns, and building detailed files about the local ecosystem. Those files now gathered dust in his study, along with veterinary supplies he'd stockpiled for injured wildlife rescue, another passion project Maggie had never fully understood until she found herself completely, devastatingly alone with nothing but his dreams for company. The grizzly bear dropped the canvas bag with a heavy thud and retreated to the tree line, her massive form melting into the shadows as if she'd never existed. Maggie stood frozen at her kitchen window, heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The bag lay motionless for several seconds before something inside shifted, causing the weathered fabric to bulge and contract with unmistakable signs of life. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay inside and call for help, Maggie found herself stepping onto the porch. Her bare feet touched the cold morning dew as she approached the mysterious bundle, each step deliberate despite her trembling legs. The bag was larger than she'd initially thought. Military surplus canvas, the kind Bernard used to haul camping gear during their younger years. But this one bore scars, torn seams, burn marks along the edges, and dark stains that made her stomach clench with dread. The zipper had been partially chewed open, revealing a glimpse of brown fur inside. As Maggie knelt beside the bag, a pair of dark, intelligent eyes peered up at her through the gap. A bear cub, no more than 8 months old, lay curled in the torn canvas like a broken toy. His breathing was shallow but steady, and when their eyes met, she saw something that stopped her cold. Not the wild fear she expected, but a weary resignation that seemed far too human for such a young creature. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her nurse's instincts overriding her fear. The cub wore a metal collar that looked crude and homemade, with what appeared to be a small recording device attached. Red welts marked his neck where the collar had rubbed, and his ribs showed clearly through his fur. This wasn't abandonment. This was rescue, delivered by a desperate mother who somehow knew Maggie would help. She carefully lifted the cub from the bag, surprised by how willingly he came to her. He made no sound of protest, only nestled against her chest with the trust of an animal who had learned to depend on human kindness. His weight was disturbingly light for his size, and she could feel the rapid flutter of his heartbeat against her palm. In her arms, he felt as fragile as the premature babies she'd once cared for in the ICU. Inside the cabin, Maggie cleared Bernard's old veterinary supplies from the hall closet, bandages, antiseptic, feeding bottles he'd used for orphaned wildlife. The cub allowed her to remove the collar, which came away revealing infected skin beneath. The recording device was still blinking with a faint red light, its memory card intact. Whatever secrets it held would have to wait. Her immediate concern was keeping this little one alive. She prepared a mixture of warm milk and honey, remembering Bernard's instructions for feeding orphaned animals. The cub drank eagerly, his tiny paws gripping the bottle with surprising dexterity. As he fed, Maggie noticed something remarkable. His eyes tracked her movements with an intelligence that seemed almost human. When she spoke to him softly, he tilted his head as if listening, understanding not just her tone but her intent. "What happened to you, little bear?" she murmured, gently cleaning the wounds around his neck. "And why did your mama bring you to me?" The answer came when she finally worked up the courage to examine the recording device. Bernard's old laptop, dusty from months of disuse, flickered to life as she inserted the memory card. The first few files showed ordinary woodland scenes, trees, streams, the kind of footage Bernard's own cameras captured daily. But as she scrolled deeper into the files, her blood turned to ice. The screen filled with images of metal cages stacked in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Inside the cages, bears of various sizes huddled together in obvious distress. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show the terrible conditions. No food or water visible, waste accumulating beneath the enclosures, and injuries that had been left untreated. Adult bears paced frantically, while cubs cowered in corners, their eyes reflecting the camera's flash like tiny mirrors of terror. Maggie's hands shook as she advanced to the next file. Male voices echoed from the laptop speakers, their words becoming clearer as her trembling fingers adjusted the volume. "These problem bears need permanent solutions," one voice declared with casual cruelty. "Sullivan's always been soft on these animals, but he's not here to interfere anymore." The voice was familiar, though it took several seconds for recognition to dawn. Sheriff Tom Bradford, Bernard's former friend turned bitter enemy over wildlife policy disputes. The same man who'd spoken at Bernard's funeral about losing a good neighbor, his condolences now revealed as hollow theater. "The client pays premium for guaranteed kills," Bradford continued in the recording. "These bears have been problematic for too long. Time to clean up Sullivan's mess once and for all." The camera must have been hidden on the mother bear herself, perhaps attached during one of their captures. As the footage continued, Maggie watched in horror as men in hunting gear discussed the bears as if they were merchandise. The operation was clearly sophisticated, wealthy clients paying enormous sums for guaranteed hunting experiences, with problem bears serving as captive prey. In one devastating sequence, the camera captured the moment when the cub in her arms was separated from his mother. The adult female's anguished roars echoed from the laptop speakers as men with cattle prods forced her into a separate cage. The cub had tried to follow, only to be kicked aside and collared with the recording device, perhaps as a cruel joke or maybe as evidence of their wildlife management for paying customers. The final files showed the warehouse being cleared, bears loaded onto trucks with out-of-state license plates. But the mother bear's cage remained, and in the last few frames, Maggie could see the magnificent animal's desperate attempt to reach her offspring. The camera must have become dislodged during the struggle because the final images were chaotic, flashes of movement, the sound of metal tearing, and then darkness. Maggie closed the laptop with shaking hands, the full scope of the tragedy beginning to dawn on her. The mother bear had somehow escaped, found her cub, and brought him to the one place she associated with safety, Bernard's sanctuary. But why had she left him here? Was she too injured to care for him? Or was this a deliberate choice born from desperation and trust? The cub stirred in his makeshift bed of towels, opening his eyes to look directly at her. In that gaze, Maggie saw something that broke her heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. This little creature had survived horrors no animal should endure, and his mother had trusted her, a stranger, with his life. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also strangely familiar. For the first time since Bernard's death, someone needed her again. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin yard. Somewhere in those woods, a mother bear waited in pain and hope, trusting that the woman who'd shared her husband's love of wildlife would protect what she could no longer defend herself. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires sent Maggie's heart into her throat. Through the kitchen window, she watched Sheriff Tom Bradford's patrol car pull into her driveway, followed by a white pickup truck bearing the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources logo. She quickly scooped the bear cub from his bed of towels, her arthritic joints protesting as she hurried toward the basement door. "Stay quiet, little one," she whispered, settling him into the old root cellar Bernard had converted into a wine storage area. The cub seemed to understand the urgency, curling into a tight ball behind several dusty bottles of Bernard's homemade elderberry wine. His dark eyes watched her with that same unsettling intelligence as she pulled an old quilt over his hiding spot. Bradford's knock came heavy and authoritative against her front door. When Maggie opened it, she found him flanked by a younger man in wildlife officer uniform, both wearing expressions of practiced concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Morning, Maggie," Bradford said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. Got some reports about a dangerous bear sighting on your property. Mrs. Patterson called it in about an hour ago. Said she saw a grizzly bear, which we both know is impossible in Virginia. Mrs. Patterson's eyesight isn't what it used to be, Maggie replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. She probably saw one of the black bears that come through here regularly. Bernard always said they look bigger when you're frightened. The wildlife officer, whose name tag read J. Morrison, stepped forward with a clipboard. Ma'am, we need to conduct a thorough search of your property for public safety. If there's an aggressive bear in the area, especially one exhibiting unusual behavior, we have protocols to follow. Bradford's smile never wavered, but his eyes held a coldness that made Maggie's skin crawl. Bernard's not here to protect his wildlife friends anymore, Maggie. Sometimes we have to make hard decisions for the greater good of the community. As the men began their search, Maggie followed at a distance, her mind racing. Bradford moved through her property with suspicious familiarity, checking areas where Bernard had once maintained feeding stations and water sources. His knowledge of the land's layout was too precise for casual observation. He'd clearly been here before, perhaps many times. Find anything interesting in Bernard's old files lately? Bradford asked casually as they walked past the tool shed. He always was meticulous about documenting things, sometimes too meticulous for his own good. The implied threat wasn't lost on Maggie. She thought about the camera footage hidden on Bernard's laptop, evidence that could destroy Bradford's operation and expose the truth about his wildlife management policies. But she also thought about the vulnerable cub hiding in her basement, completely dependent on her protection. Bernard kept his business to himself, she replied carefully. I haven't touched his study since the funeral. Too many memories. Morrison emerged from checking the perimeter, shaking his head. No immediate signs of bear activity, Sheriff. Some old tracks by the stream, but they look like black bear to me. Bradford's jaw tightened with frustration. Keep looking. Mrs. Patterson was very specific about what she saw. A bear dragging something across this property, something that could indicate aggressive or territorial behavior. As the search continued, Maggie noticed Bradford paying particular attention to areas around the cabin itself. He examined the porch where the canvas bag had been dropped, kneeling to study scuff marks in the dirt that the bear's claws had left. His expertise was evident. This wasn't the fumbling investigation of a small-town sheriff, but the methodical work of someone intimately familiar with bear behavior. Tom, Maggie said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. Why are you really here? We've had black bears on this property for decades without incident. Bernard documented over 30 different individuals that passed through safely. Bradford stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. His friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something darker underneath. Bernard had a lot of ideas about wildlife management that didn't align with modern safety protocols. Some of his projects may have created problems we're still dealing with. What kind of problems? The kind that require permanent solutions. The words echoed the voice from the hidden camera footage, confirming Maggie's worst fears. Bradford wasn't here to protect the community. He was here to eliminate evidence of his crimes. Morrison checked his watch and called out from near the tree line. Sheriff, we should head to the Brennan place. They reported livestock disturbances last night. Bradford nodded, but kept his eyes fixed on Maggie. We'll be back tomorrow with a larger team and proper equipment. If there's a dangerous animal on this property, we'll find it. And when we do, we'll handle it appropriately. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Maggie watched the vehicles disappear down her driveway before rushing back to the basement. The cub was exactly where she'd left him, but his small body was trembling with stress. When she lifted the quilt, his eyes showed the same terror she'd seen in the warehouse footage. I know, sweetheart, she whispered, gathering him into her arms. He scares me, too. That evening, as she prepared another bottle for the cub's feeding, Maggie's mind churned with impossible choices. Keeping the cub meant defying a corrupt sheriff who clearly had no qualms about eliminating witnesses. But turning him over to Bradford meant signing his death warrant and betraying the trust his mother had placed in her. The cub had grown stronger throughout the day, even attempting to play with an old sock she'd given him. His intelligence continued to amaze her. He'd already learned to recognize the sound of her footsteps versus others, hiding whenever unfamiliar voices approached the cabin. It was as if he understood the danger he represented simply by existing. As darkness fell, Maggie made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She carried the cub to Bernard's study and settled into his old leather chair, the same one where he'd spent countless hours reviewing wildlife footage and documenting animal behavior. For the first time since his death, being in this room didn't feel like a punishment. "Your daddy would have known what to do," she told the cub, who was contentedly chewing on her sleeve. "He always said animals choose their own families when they need them most." She opened Bernard's desk drawer and found his personal journal filled with meticulous notes about the local bear population. As she read, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. Bernard had been tracking the disappearance of several bear families over the past 2 years, noting their sudden absence from traditional territory without explanation. His final entries, dated just weeks before his heart attack, expressed growing concern about unofficial wildlife removal operations and unauthorized personnel accessing sanctuary grounds. The last entry, written in Bernard's careful handwriting just 3 days before he died, sent chills down her spine. TB, becoming increasingly aggressive about bear populations. Threatened legal action if I don't support his management protocols. Fear he's already acting without authorization. Must document everything. Trust no one in official capacity. TB, Tom Bradford. Bernard had known about the illegal operation and had been gathering evidence when he died. The heart attack that had seemed so sudden, so random, now felt ominously convenient for Bradford's timeline. The cub stirred in her lap, making soft, huffing sounds that reminded her of contentment. Despite everything he'd endured, he still possessed the capacity for trust and affection. In that moment, Maggie realized she wasn't just protecting an animal, she was safeguarding the last living witness to crimes that had likely cost Bernard his life. Tomorrow would bring Bradford back with reinforcements, but tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. For the first time in months, Maggie Sullivan had a purpose that extended beyond her own survival. Someone, a small, vulnerable someone, was counting on her to be strong, to be brave, and to honor the legacy of compassion that Bernard had left behind. 200 miles away in Richmond, Tori Sullivan Hayes sat in her darkened apartment, staring at her laptop screen with growing alarm. The Ring doorbell camera she'd secretly installed at her mother's cabin 6 months ago, a guilt-driven attempt to monitor Maggie's declining health from a distance, had captured every moment of Sheriff Bradford's threatening visit. What she'd witnessed through the grainy footage made her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and shame. For months, Tori had been watching her mother's gradual deterioration through the digital lens. Too proud to reach out directly, but too worried to completely disconnect. She'd seen Maggie talking to her father's photograph each morning, witnessed the careful rationing of medications, observed the way her once vibrant mother had shrunk into herself after Bernard's death. The guilt of their 15-year estrangement weighed heavier with each passing day, but neither woman seemed capable of bridging the chasm that had opened between them. Now, as Tori replayed Bradford's visit for the 3rd time, she recognized the barely concealed menace in his voice, the way he'd searched the property with predatory focus. Her mother was in danger, and Tori's years of stubborn silence suddenly felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, then hesitated. What could she say after so many years of mutual silence? How could she explain that she'd been watching, worrying, secretly paying some of her mother's bills through anonymous transfers to avoid the confrontation that acknowledgement would require? Instead, she opened her laptop and began researching Sheriff Tom Bradford. What she found in the next 2 hours made her blood run cold. Federal wildlife violation reports from neighboring counties, missing persons cases involving environmental activists that had been quietly closed, and a pattern of aggressive bear relocations that seemed to correlate with mysterious population declines. Most disturbing was a series of hunting permits issued to out-of-state clients willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed encounters with problem wildlife. Tori's background in investigative journalism, dormant since her unemployment began, suddenly roared back to life. She cross-referenced hunting permits with missing wildlife reports, mapped Bradford's jurisdiction against suspicious animal disappearances, and discovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond one rural Virginia county. The pieces formed a horrifying picture of systematic wildlife trafficking disguised as legitimate animal control. At 3 a.m., she placed an anonymous call to the FBI's wildlife crime tip line, carefully avoiding any mention of her mother while providing detailed information about Bradford's operation. The agent who took her call seemed genuinely interested, especially when she mentioned the involvement of wealthy out-of-state hunters and the suspicious timing of environmental activists' disappearances. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Maggie was experiencing her own sleepless night. The bear cub had grown increasingly restless as darkness fell, making soft whimpering sounds that tugged at her heart. She'd tried everything: warm milk, gentle stroking, even playing some of Bernard's classical music, but nothing seemed to calm his obvious distress. Around midnight she understood why. The low rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the valley, followed by the slam of truck doors and the crunch of boots on gravel. Flashlight beams swept across her property like searching fingers, accompanied by voices trying unsuccessfully to remain quiet. "Keep it down," Bradford's voice carried through the night air. "We don't want to wake the old lady until we're ready." Maggie peered through her bedroom curtains and counted at least 4 men moving through her woods with military precision. They weren't dressed as law enforcement or wildlife officers. These were hunters, armed with high-powered rifles and equipped with night vision scopes. Bradford's wildlife management team had arrived early for their real mission. The cub in her arms had gone completely still, every muscle tensed with inherited fear. His mother had trained him well. When predators hunted, survival meant absolute silence. Maggie held him close, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her chest as the search party methodically worked their way toward the cabin. Through Bernard's old ham radio, which she'd kept operational more from habit than purpose, fragments of their communication crackled through the static. Thermal shows heat signature in basement. Multiple targets possible. Permission to breach? Bradford's response was swift and decisive. "Negative on breach. We stick to the plan. Wait for dawn, then official search with backup. Need this to look legitimate for the report." The hunters retreated before sunrise, but their message was clear. They knew exactly where the cub was hidden, and they were merely waiting for daylight to provide legal cover for their assault. Maggie had perhaps 6 hours to save a life, but she had no idea how. As the first pale light crept across the mountains, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown Richmond number, but something about the timing made her answer, despite her better judgment. "Mom?" The voice was older, more strained than she remembered, but unmistakably Tori's. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. "Tori? How did you—" "I've been watching the house cameras, Mom. I saw what happened yesterday with the sheriff. You're in serious danger, and I think I know why." For the next 20 minutes, mother and daughter shared more honest conversation than they'd managed in 15 years. Tori explained her research into Bradford's operation, the FBI tip she'd filed, and her growing realization that their father's death might not have been as natural as it appeared. Maggie, in turn, revealed the cub's presence, the hidden camera footage, and Bernard's journal entries documenting his suspicions about illegal wildlife trafficking. "Mom, you can't face this alone," Tori said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm driving up there right now." "I should have come months ago. I should have been there when Dad died, should have helped you through." "Sweetheart, it's too dangerous," Maggie interrupted, though her heart was singing at the sound of her daughter's voice. "Bradford isn't just corrupt, he's desperate. People who threaten his operation have a way of disappearing. Then we make sure he can't make you disappear too. I've already contacted federal agents. They're investigating, but they need evidence, real evidence, not just anonymous tips." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles returning to Maggie's driveway. This time, Bradford arrived with an official entourage, state wildlife officers, local deputies, and what appeared to be a television news crew. He was staging a public wildlife capture for the cameras, creating legal justification for whatever happened next. Maggie watched through her window as Bradford positioned the news crew to capture dangerous wildlife removal in action. His performance was masterful. Concerned sheriff protecting helpless elderly resident from rogue bear threat. The reporters hung on his every word as he described the unprecedented grizzly bear incident that required immediate intervention. "Mrs. Sullivan has been through enough tragedy," Bradford told the cameras with practiced sincerity. "Losing her husband 6 months ago, now dealing with this wildlife emergency alone. We're here to ensure her safety and resolve this situation humanely." The word humanely dripped with false compassion, and Maggie felt sick knowing what it really meant. The cub would be killed on camera, portrayed as a dangerous predator, eliminated in the name of public safety. Bradford's operation would gain legitimacy while disposing of the last witness to his crimes. As the official search party approached her front door, Maggie made a desperate decision. She bundled the cub into a hiking backpack, zipping him inside with air holes Bernard had cut for injured wildlife transport. The little bear tolerated the confinement with remarkable patience, as if he understood this was their only chance for survival. She slipped out the back door as Bradford's team entered through the front, heading for the thick woods where she and Bernard had once spent countless hours hiking and exploring. The terrain was treacherous for a 67-year-old woman carrying extra weight, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she still possessed. Behind her, she could hear Bradford's furious voice as his team reported no bear found in the basement. "Search again. I know it's here somewhere. That old woman is hiding something." The backpack shifted as the cub adjusted his position, and Maggie whispered reassurances while pushing deeper into the forest. She had no real plan beyond reaching the old fire tower on the ridge where Bernard's emergency radio might reach help, but with each step, she felt more alive than she had in months. Someone needed her, and she would not let that someone down. An hour into her escape, crashing sounds behind her announced pursuit. Bradford had abandoned all pretense of an official search and deployed his hunters to track her through the woods. Their voices carried through the trees, no longer bothering with stealth or protocol. "She can't have gone far," Morrison's voice echoed off the rocky outcroppings. "70-year-old woman carrying dead weight won't make it to the ridge before we catch her." But Morrison had underestimated both Maggie's determination and her intimate knowledge of the terrain. Bernard had shown her every deer path, every hidden stream crossing, every shortcut through these mountains. She moved with purpose, born of memory and love, following routes she hadn't walked in years, but somehow remembered perfectly. The cub remained silent in his makeshift carrier, occasionally pressing a small paw against her back as if offering encouragement. His trust was absolute, and that trust gave her courage when her aging body screamed for rest. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from Tori. FBI agents en route. Keep moving. I'm coming too. For the first time since Bernard's death, Maggie Sullivan felt hope blooming in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Her daughter was coming home, federal help was on the way, and in her backpack, a small life depended on her strength. At 67, she was discovering she still had fight left in her, and she intended to use every bit of it. The pursuit continued behind her, but with each step toward the ridge, Maggie felt more confident they would survive this nightmare. Bradford's corruption was finally coming to light, and she would live to see justice done, not just for the cub she carried, but for Bernard's memory and all the wildlife that had suffered under Bradford's twisted version of protection. The fire tower emerged through the morning mist like a skeletal monument to better times, its rusted metal framework stretching 40 feet into the Virginia sky. Maggie's legs trembled with exhaustion as she reached the base, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give out before she could complete her mission. The bear cub had grown heavier with each mile of their desperate flight, but his occasional soft huffs against her back reminded her why every burning step was worth taking. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit had grown closer. Bradford's hunting party moved through the forest with predatory efficiency, their voices carrying threats that made her blood run cold. "When we find her, make it look like a bear attack," Morrison's voice echoed off the rocky ridge. "Old woman gets too close to dangerous wildlife. Tragic but necessary outcome." Maggie's arthritic fingers fumbled with the tower's access ladder, each rung a monumental challenge with the cub's weight pulling at her shoulders. At her age, climbing 40 feet had seemed impossible, even in her desperate planning, but maternal instinct had taken over her rational mind. The little bear needed protection, and she was the only barrier between him and Bradford's manufactured justice. Halfway up the tower, her phone rang with startling volume in the mountain silence. She nearly lost her grip answering it, recognizing Tori's number with a surge of hope that almost brought tears to her eyes. "Mom, where are you?" Tori's voice crackled through poor reception, strained with worry and determination. "Fire tower on Hawksbill Ridge," Maggie whispered, continuing her agonizing climb. "They're hunting us, baby." "Bradford brought professional killers. This isn't about wildlife management anymore. I'm 20 minutes away with FBI agents. Agent Sarah Chen specializes in wildlife trafficking. She says Bradford's operation is bigger than we imagined. Just hold on, Mom. Please just hold on." The connection cut as Maggie reached the tower's observation platform, her muscles screaming in protest. She gently lowered the backpack and unzipped it, allowing the cub to emerge into the morning sunlight. His dark eyes blinked against the brightness, but he immediately pressed close to her leg, seeking comfort in her familiar scent. From this height, she could see Bradford's team spreading through the forest below like a military operation. 8 men with high-powered rifles moved in coordinated patterns, cutting off escape routes with professional precision. These weren't weekend hunters or overwhelmed wildlife officers. They were experienced killers who'd clearly done this before. Bradford himself emerged from the tree line directly below the tower, his face twisted with rage as he spotted Maggie's position. "Come down now, Maggie," he shouted, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "You're only making this harder on yourself." "Like you made it hard on Bernard?" she called back, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Did you kill my husband, Tom? Was his heart attack as convenient as it seemed?" Bradford's silence stretched long enough to provide her answer. When he finally spoke again, his mask of official concern had completely fallen away. "Bernard was stubborn. He wouldn't listen to reason about controlling the bear population. Sometimes heart conditions get aggravated by stress, especially when people stick their noses where they don't belong." The admission hung in the mountain air like poison. Maggie felt her last doubts about Bradford's guilt evaporate, replaced by a cold fury that steadied her shaking hands. This man had murdered her husband, terrorized countless families of wildlife, and now threatened to kill an innocent animal to protect his criminal empire. "You're insane if you think I'm coming down," she replied, gathering the cub into her arms. "This little one deserves better than your version of wildlife management." Bradford raised his rifle, the scope glinting in the morning sun. "Then you've chosen to die with it. Your daughter will read in the papers how a grieving widow tragically fell victim to the same dangerous bear that killed her husband. Very poetic, don't you think?" The cub seemed to sense the danger, pressing deeper into Maggie's embrace with trust that broke her heart. In his small face, she saw every patient she'd ever fought to save, every life that had depended on her skills and compassion. This was her final patient, perhaps her most important one, and she would not let fear decide his fate. "Shoot, then," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "But you'll have to explain to federal agents why you killed a 67-year-old woman and an orphaned bear cub. They're already investigating your operation, Tom. My daughter's been gathering evidence for months." Bradford's confidence flickered for the first time, uncertainty creeping into his expression. "You're bluffing. That estranged daughter of yours hasn't spoken to you in years. She's not coming to save you now." "Want to bet your freedom on that assumption?" Maggie asked, just as the distant sound of helicopter rotors began echoing through the valley. The noise grew steadily louder, accompanied by the wail of approaching sirens on the mountain road below. The FBI helicopter crested the ridge like cavalry arriving in an old western, its powerful rotors whipping the trees into frenzied motion. Through the aircraft's windows, Maggie could see federal agents in tactical gear, their weapons trained on Bradford's hunting party below. A loudspeaker crackled to life, the amplified voice cutting through the mountain air with unmistakable authority. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Wildlife Crime Unit. All personnel below the fire tower, drop your weapons and place your hands where we can see them. This area is now under federal jurisdiction." Bradford's hunting party scattered like startled deer, but federal agents were already emerging from multiple points around the ridge, having apparently been deployed during the chase. The coordination was impressive. Tori hadn't just called for help, she'd orchestrated a full federal response to her mother's crisis. "Tom Bradford," the helicopter loudspeaker continued, "you're under arrest for violation of the Lacey Act, conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, and murder in the first degree. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Bradford's face contorted with desperate rage as he realized his empire was crumbling around him. Instead of surrendering, he raised his rifle toward the fire tower, his intention clear. If he was going down, he'd take Maggie and the cub with him. "This is your fault," he screamed up at her. "Bernard's death is on your head. Every bear that dies now dies, because you couldn't mind your own business." The rifle shot cracked across the mountains like thunder, but Bradford's aim was spoiled by return fire from FBI snipers positioned around the ridge. The bullet went wide, striking the tower's metal framework and sending up sparks. Bradford stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where a federal marksman's bullet had found its mark. As Bradford fell, cursing and bleeding, federal agents swarmed his position. The hunt was over, but Maggie found herself unable to move, adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and shock. The cub in her arms whimpered softly, sensing the change in her energy as the immediate danger passed. The helicopter landed in a small clearing near the tower base, and Maggie watched through tears of relief as a familiar figure emerged from one of the federal vehicles racing up the mountain road. Tori looked older, more careworn than Maggie remembered, but she moved with determined purpose as she approached the fire tower. "Mom!" Tori's voice carried up the tower with 15 years of suppressed emotion. "It's over! You can come down now!" But Maggie found herself frozen on the platform, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. She'd faced down a killer, protected an innocent life, and somehow survived to see justice done. The elderly woman who'd counted pills and prepared for death just days ago had discovered reserves of courage she'd forgotten she possessed. More importantly, her daughter had come home. After all the bitter words, stubborn silence, and wounded pride that had divided their family, crisis had finally brought them back together. The cost had been enormous. Bernard's death, months of isolation, and a terror she'd never forget. But somehow, holding this small bear cub while watching FBI agents arrest her husband's killer, Maggie felt more alive than she had in years. Agent Chen's voice drifted up from below, professional but kind. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to get you and the cub medical attention. Can you make it down the ladder, or should we bring equipment up to you?" Looking down at the concerned faces of her daughter and the federal agents, Maggie realized she was ready to descend. The literal and metaphorical heights she'd climbed to save this little life had somehow saved her own soul in the process. At 67, she'd discovered that purpose and courage don't retire. They simply wait for the right moment to emerge. The descent from the fire tower proved more treacherous than the climb up. Maggie's legs, weakened by exhaustion and adrenaline crash, trembled with each careful step down the rusted ladder. Agent Chen had positioned herself directly below, ready to catch both woman and cub if Maggie's grip failed. The bear cub, sensing the precarious nature of their situation, remained perfectly still in the backpack, his small body pressed against Maggie's spine like a living reminder of what she'd fought to protect. 15 feet from the ground, disaster struck. A rung, weakened by decades of mountain weather, gave way under Maggie's weight with a sharp metallic crack. She felt herself falling backward, the cub's panicked squeal piercing the morning air as they tumbled toward the rocky ground below. Time seemed suspended in that moment of freefall. She saw Tori's horrified face, heard Agent Chen's shout of warning, felt the terrible certainty that her final act would be failing the innocent life she'd tried so desperately to save. But instead of crushing impact against stone, Maggie found herself caught in powerful arms that absorbed the shock of their fall. Agent Chen had positioned herself perfectly, her tactical training allowing her to break Maggie's fall while protecting the cub. They landed hard but safely in a pile of fallen leaves, the agent taking the brunt of the impact while cradling Maggie and her precious cargo. "Is he okay?" Maggie gasped, her first thought for the cub despite her own jarring pain. She fumbled with the backpack zipper, her arthritic fingers suddenly clumsy with fear that the fall had injured him. The cub emerged from the pack with remarkable composure, blinking in the dappled sunlight and immediately pressing close to Maggie's chest. His calm demeanor belied the trauma of their shared ordeal, and Maggie marveled at the resilience hidden within his small frame. This little survivor had endured captivity, separation from his mother, and now a death-defying escape, yet he still possessed the capacity for trust and affection. Tori reached them first, her face streaked with tears she'd apparently been holding back for hours. "Mom, I thought I'd lost you too," she whispered, kneeling beside Maggie with 15 years of estrangement dissolving in a single moment of shared terror. "When I saw you fall—" "I'm okay, sweetheart," Maggie managed, though her voice shook with delayed shock. "We're both okay." She looked down at the cub who had nestled against her with such complete trust that it broke her heart. "This little one is tougher than he looks." Agent Chen radioed for medical personnel while maintaining a protective perimeter around the small group. Her professional demeanor softened as she watched the reunion between mother and daughter, understanding that she was witnessing more than just the resolution of a wildlife trafficking case. This was a family healing itself through shared crisis, finding their way back to each other through the most unlikely circumstances. "Mrs. Sullivan," Agent Chen said gently, "we need to get both you and the cub to a veterinary hospital for examination. You've both been through significant trauma, and we want to ensure there are no internal injuries from the fall." As they waited for the medical team, Maggie found herself studying Tori's face with new eyes. Her daughter had grown into a beautiful woman, despite the years of separation, but lines of worry and financial stress marked her features. The realization that Tori had been secretly monitoring her welfare hit Maggie with a wave of profound gratitude mixed with maternal guilt. "How long have you been watching the cabin?" Maggie asked softly. Tori's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Since Dad's funeral. I installed the camera the day after the service when you were napping. I wanted to make sure you were okay, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us after so many years of silence." "You've been paying some of my bills too, haven't you?" Maggie pressed, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Those anonymous transfers that kept my utilities from being cut off?" "I couldn't let you lose the house," Tori admitted, tears flowing freely now. "It was all I could do from a distance. I wanted to help more, but my pride kept getting in the way. I kept telling myself you didn't want me there, that you were better off without my interference." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the base of the ridge. Medical personnel were treating Bradford's gunshot wound while federal agents processed the scene, but Bradford himself was still conscious and ranting with the fury of a man watching his life's work crumble. "You don't understand what you've done," he shouted at anyone within earshot. "Those bears are killers. I've spent years protecting this community from the kind of tragedy that destroyed my family. Every bear I've eliminated has saved human lives." Agent Chen approached the group with a grim expression. "Bradford's talking, but not in a way that helps his case. He's confessing to everything: the illegal hunting operation, the bear trafficking, even making threats about your husband's death. His lawyer's going to have a nightmare trying to build any kind of defense." Maggie felt a cold satisfaction at Bradford's downfall, but it was tempered by profound sadness for the man he'd once been. She remembered him as a young deputy, eager to serve his community and protect its residents. The transformation from protector to predator served as a stark reminder of how grief could poison the human soul when left untreated. The medical team arrived with equipment to safely transport both Maggie and the cub to the regional animal hospital. As they prepared for the journey down the mountain, Maggie realized this was likely the beginning of the end of her time with the little bear. Wildlife regulations would eventually require his placement in a proper sanctuary or rehabilitation facility, regardless of the bond they'd formed. "What happens to him now?" she asked Agent Chen, her voice thick with impending loss. "That depends on several factors," the agent replied diplomatically. "His health, his ability to survive in the wild, the availability of appropriate facilities. But Mrs. Sullivan, you should know that your actions today saved more than just this cub's life. The evidence you've provided will help us shut down a trafficking network that spans multiple states." As they loaded her onto the medical transport, Maggie cradled the cub one last time before the veterinary team took him for examination. In his dark eyes, she saw not just trust, but gratitude, the same expression she'd witnessed in countless patients over her 42-year nursing career. She'd devoted her life to healing, and in this final act of caregiving, she'd found a purpose that transcended her own grief and loneliness. The veterinary hospital in Harrisonburg buzzed with activity as news crews gathered outside, drawn by reports of the dramatic wildlife trafficking bust and the elderly woman who'd risked everything to save a bear cub. Inside the sterile examination room, Dr. Rebecca Martinez worked with gentle precision to assess both Maggie's injuries and the cub's overall health, while federal agents waited for her medical report. "Remarkable," Dr. Martinez murmured as she completed her examination of the cub. "Despite everything this little one has endured, he's in surprisingly good condition. Malnourished, certainly, and showing signs of stress, but no permanent physical damage. His psychological resilience is extraordinary for an animal that's experienced such trauma." Maggie, her left wrist now properly splinted and her cuts cleaned and bandaged, watched from a nearby chair as the veterinarian continued her assessment. The cub had remained calm throughout the examination, occasionally looking toward Maggie as if seeking reassurance that she was still there. Their bond had deepened through shared danger, creating a connection that transcended species barriers. "What about his future?" Tori asked, her voice carefully controlled. She'd remained at her mother's side throughout the medical evaluations, 15 years of distance evaporating in the face of their shared ordeal. "Will he be able to survive in the wild after what he's been through?" Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with Agent Chen before answering. "That's complicated. Normally, a cub this age would still be with his mother, learning essential survival skills. The trauma he's experienced, combined with extended human contact, has likely impaired his natural instincts. Traditional rehabilitation might be challenging." Agent Chen stepped forward with documents that would determine the cub's fate. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to discuss some difficult realities. Based on our investigation, we believe this cub's mother is dead. The warehouse footage shows her in the final stages of infection from untreated wounds. She used her last strength to escape and bring her baby to you." The words hit Maggie like physical blows, each revelation adding weight to the tragedy they'd uncovered. She thought of the magnificent mother bear, dying alone in the woods after making the ultimate maternal sacrifice. The image brought tears she'd been holding back throughout the crisis, grief for a creature she'd never truly met, but who had trusted her with the most precious thing in her world. "There's something else," Agent Chen continued, her professional demeanor softening. "We found Bernard's research files in Bradford's possession, along with evidence that suggests your husband's death wasn't natural. Bradford had been monitoring Bernard's investigation into the trafficking operation for months. The stress of those threats, combined with medications Bradford may have tampered with, likely triggered the heart attack." Tori's sharp intake of breath echoed through the examination room. "He murdered Dad? Actually murdered him?" "We're building a case for felony murder," Agent Chen confirmed. "Bradford's actions directly contributed to Bernard's death, even if he didn't pull a trigger. Combined with the wildlife trafficking charges and attempted murder of you and the cub, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison." The revelation should have brought satisfaction, but Maggie felt only a bone-deep weariness. Justice for Bernard wouldn't bring him back, wouldn't erase the months of loneliness and despair she'd endured. What mattered now was the future, hers, Tori's, and the small life that had somehow brought their family back together. Dr. Martinez approached with a clipboard and an expression that suggested difficult news. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to discuss placement options for the cub. Standard protocol requires relocation to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility, but given the unique circumstances of this case—" "What are you saying?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Several factors complicate normal rehabilitation," the veterinarian explained. "His age, the trauma he's experienced, his unusual comfort with humans, and the probability that his mother's death left critical gaps in his survival education. Most facilities would classify him as non-releasable, suitable only for educational programs or permanent captivity." The thought of the trusting little creature spending his life in a cage made Maggie's chest tighten with protective fury. After everything he'd survived, he deserved better than a lifetime of confinement. She looked at his small face, remembering how he'd comforted her during their darkest moments, how his presence had given her purpose when she'd thought her useful life was over. "What alternatives exist?" Tori asked, moving closer to her mother with an expression of growing understanding. Agent Chen consulted her notes before responding. "In exceptional circumstances, with proper permits and facilities, private wildlife sanctuaries can house non-releasable animals. It requires extensive documentation, regular inspections, and proof of adequate care facilities, but it's possible. A spark of hope ignited in Maggie's chest. Bernard always dreamed of turning our property into an official wildlife sanctuary. He had plans drawn up, permits partially filed. The infrastructure is already in place. "Mom," Tori said softly, recognition dawning in her voice. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Maggie reached out to gently stroke the cub's fur, marveling at how such a small creature had managed to save not just his own life, but hers as well. "This little one needs a home, and I need a purpose." Bernard would have loved the idea of his sanctuary finally becoming reality. Dr. Martinez smiled for the first time since their arrival. "I'd be willing to serve as consulting veterinarian for such a facility. The educational value alone would be enormous, showing visitors how human-wildlife conflicts can be resolved through compassion rather than violence. The federal permits can be expedited given the circumstances," Agent Chen added. "Your cooperation in this case has been instrumental in dismantling a major trafficking network. I think we can find ways to facilitate your sanctuary application." Tori knelt beside her mother's chair, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, this is perfect." "I could help with the sanctuary, maybe even move back to the area. My kids could grow up knowing their grandmother, learning about wildlife conservation." The mention of grandchildren she'd never met sent a jolt of joy through Maggie's weary heart. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed their family was somehow creating opportunities for healing and connection she'd never dared imagine. "Your children?" Maggie whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Emma's 8 and Michael's 5, Tori said, pulling out her phone to show pictures of 2 beautiful children with Bernard's distinctive eyes. "They've asked about their grandmother so many times, but I didn't know how to explain our estrangement. Maybe now we can start over, build the relationships we should have had all along." The cub stirred in his temporary enclosure, making soft, huffing sounds that drew everyone's attention. He was looking directly at Maggie with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence and trust. In that moment she realized this small bear had become more than just a rescue mission. He was the bridge between her old life of grief and isolation and a new chapter filled with purpose and family. "What would we call him?" Maggie asked, the decision crystallizing in her heart. Tori smiled through her tears. "How about hope? Because that's what he's given us. Hope for the future. Hope for our family. Hope that good can come from even the darkest situations." Dr. Martinez made notes on her clipboard while Agent Chen prepared paperwork that would change multiple lives with the stroke of a pen. Outside, media crews waited for the story of corruption exposed and justice served. But inside the examination room, a more profound transformation was taking place. An elderly woman who'd prepared for death had instead found new life. A daughter who'd thought she'd lost her family forever was coming home. A traumatized bear cub who should have died in captivity was about to become the cornerstone of a sanctuary dedicated to the very principles his sacrifice had embodied. "There's one more thing," Agent Chen said, consulting her phone. "Bradford wants to speak with you, Mrs. Sullivan. He's requested a meeting before his transfer to federal custody. You're under no obligation to see him, but he claims he has information about Bernard that you need to hear." Maggie considered the request, weighing her desire for closure against the risk of reopening psychological wounds. The man who'd killed her husband and terrorized her community was hardly deserving of consideration, but something in Agent Chen's expression suggested this wasn't a simple attempt at manipulation. "What kind of information?" she asked carefully. "He won't say, but his lawyer indicates it relates to Bernard's final days and might provide answers to questions you didn't know you had." Looking at the small bear who'd somehow orchestrated this entire chain of redemption, Maggie realized she needed to face Bradford one final time. Not for his benefit, but for her own closure and for the memory of the man whose love of wildlife had ultimately brought justice to those who would abuse it. "I'll see him," she decided, her voice steady with newfound strength. "But not alone, and not without hope nearby. Whatever Bradford has to say, we'll face it together." 6 months later, the Bernard Sullivan Wildlife Sanctuary buzzed with the cheerful chaos of its grand opening celebration. Families from across the Blue Ridge region had gathered to witness the transformation of a grieving widow's property into a beacon of hope for wildlife conservation. Children pressed against the viewing platform railings, watching in wonder as Hope, now a robust young bear approaching his first birthday, demonstrated the intelligence and gentle nature that had captured hearts nationwide. Maggie stood at the podium, her silver hair catching the autumn sunlight as she addressed the crowd of visitors, donors, and media representatives. At 71, she carried herself with a vitality that seemed to radiate from within, purpose and family love having restored the spark that grief had nearly extinguished. When my husband Bernard first dreamed of this sanctuary 30 years ago, he believed that understanding leads to compassion, and compassion leads to coexistence, Maggie began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. He never could have imagined that his vision would become reality through the courage of a mother bear who trusted a stranger with her most precious gift. In the front row, Tori beamed with pride while 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Michael squirmed with barely contained excitement. The children had spent the summer helping their grandmother prepare for this day, learning about wildlife conservation while rebuilding family bonds that distance and pride had nearly destroyed. Emma had appointed herself Hope's unofficial biographer, documenting his daily activities in a journal she planned to turn into a children's book about human-animal friendship. Dr. Rebecca Martinez approached the microphone next, her official veterinary report in hand. "Hope represents something extraordinary in wildlife rehabilitation," she announced. "His psychological resilience and continued trust in humans has allowed us to create an educational program that demonstrates how trauma can be overcome through patience, love, and proper care. Children who visit Hope leave understanding that wildlife doesn't have to be feared. It can be respected, protected, and celebrated." The crowd applauded as Hope himself made his scheduled appearance in the large, naturalistic enclosure that had become his home. The space Bernard had envisioned, complete with streams, caves, climbing structures, and native vegetation, provided Hope with an environment rich enough to satisfy his physical and mental needs while allowing safe observation by visitors. Hope had grown into a magnificent young bear, his glossy coat and bright eyes reflecting the excellent care he'd received. More importantly, his behavior around humans remained gentle and curious, rather than aggressive or fearful. He seemed to understand his role as an ambassador for his species, often positioning himself where visitors could observe him while maintaining the dignity of a wild creature. Agent Sarah Chen stepped forward to present the sanctuary with its federal wildlife education license, making the facility officially recognized as a conservation partner. "The investigation that began with Hope's rescue has led to the dismantling of trafficking networks across 7 states, she announced. 43 animals have been recovered and placed in appropriate facilities, and 18 individuals are facing federal charges. This sanctuary stands as proof that one person's courage can create ripples of positive change far beyond what they ever imagined." As the formal presentations concluded, Maggie found herself standing beside Hope's enclosure with a small group of special guests, including Mrs. Patterson, now 82 and delighted to serve as the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator, and several families whose children had been inspired by Hope's story to pursue careers in wildlife conservation. "Grandma Maggie," Emma tugged at her sleeve with the persistence of a determined 8-year-old. "Tell everyone about the surprise visitor." Maggie smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. 3 weeks earlier, trail cameras had captured images of a large female black bear with 2 cubs visiting the sanctuary grounds at dawn. The mother bear had approached Hope's enclosure fence and spent nearly an hour in what appeared to be communication with the young grizzly. Wildlife biologists theorized that news of the sanctuary had somehow spread through the local bear community, with mothers bringing their cubs to observe this unusual example of human-bear cooperation. "It seems word has gotten out among our wild neighbors that this is a safe place," Maggie explained to the gathered crowd. "We've documented 7 different black bear families visiting the sanctuary perimeter, apparently teaching their cubs that not all human spaces are dangerous." Hope has become something of a teacher himself, demonstrating that trust between species is possible. Tori joined her mother at the fence, her own transformation over the past months equally remarkable. She'd left her Richmond apartment to move into the renovated guest cabin on the sanctuary property, finding purpose in managing the facility's educational programs while rebuilding the relationship with her mother. That distance and pride had nearly destroyed. "Mom," Tori said softly, "there's someone here who wants to meet you." Following Tori's gaze, Maggie spotted a woman in her 30s approaching with tentative steps and an expression of nervous determination. She carried a small child, perhaps 3 years old, who stared at Hope with wide-eyed fascination. "Mrs. Sullivan," the woman began, her voice shaking with emotion. "My name is Lisa Chen, Agent Chen's sister. My daughter Clara has been following Hope's story since the beginning. She was born with severe anxiety disorders, afraid of everything, people, animals, even leaving the house. But something about Hope's story gave her courage. She's been asking to meet the brave bear for months." Maggie knelt to the child's eye level, her heart immediately going out to this little girl who understood fear too well. "Hello, Clara. Would you like to see Hope up close?" Clara nodded solemnly, then whispered, "Is he really not scary?" "Mommy says some bears are mean, but Hope is different." "Hope is very special," Maggie agreed, taking the child's small hand. "He understands that kindness is stronger than fear, and love is more powerful than anger. Would you like to help me give him his afternoon treat?" As Clara tentatively approached the feeding platform, Hope seemed to sense her nervousness. The young bear moved slowly and deliberately, positioning himself where the child could see him clearly without feeling overwhelmed. When Clara successfully delivered a piece of fruit through the secure feeding slot, Hope's gentle acceptance of the offering brought tears to her mother's eyes. "He's saying thank you," Clara announced with wonder, watching Hope's careful movements. "He knows I was scared, but he's being nice anyway." The interaction represented everything the sanctuary hoped to achieve: breaking down fear through understanding, building bridges between species through respect and compassion. As the day's celebrations continued, Maggie found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a broken woman preparing for death, counting pills and talking to photographs while grieving alone in a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home. Today, she stood surrounded by family, friends, and community members, united in celebration of life, hope, and the healing power of purpose. Hope had saved more than just himself when his mother delivered him to Maggie's doorstep. He'd saved an entire family and inspired a community to choose compassion over fear. As we close Hope's remarkable journey, I want to speak directly to those of you who might be feeling like Maggie did at the beginning, wondering if your purpose has passed, if your best years are behind you, if anyone truly needs what you have to offer anymore. At 67, Maggie thought she was preparing for the end, counting pills and talking to photographs, while the world moved on without her. But sometimes, life sends us exactly what we need when we least expect it. For Maggie, it was a frightened bear cub who needed her nursing skills, her courage, and her heart. That little creature didn't just save himself. He saved her from a life of quiet desperation and gave her 5 more years of profound purpose, reconnection with her estranged daughter, and the joy of meeting grandchildren she thought she'd never know. Your story isn't over either. Whether it's a volunteer opportunity, a family member who needs reconciliation, or a cause that ignites your passion, your experience and wisdom are still desperately needed in this world. The question isn't whether you have something valuable to offer, it's whether you're ready to recognize the opportunity when it appears at your door. Questions for you. What bear cub moment might be waiting in your life right now? Have you noticed any opportunities to use your experience to help others that you've been hesitating to pursue? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their own second chapter of purpose.